And at that moment, I realized they really do hate America. How could you possibly live in the freest nation in the history of the world and see only oppression? How could you live in the least imperialist power in human history and see us as the ultimate in imperialism? How can you live in the least bigoted nation in human history and, as Joe Biden said, see racism lurking in every dark shadow?
For as long as I've been politically minded, I have wondered how the leftist mind works. It was a riddle that bothered me very much, and I could never find the answer. I often gave up settling with, perhaps some people are just more susceptible to the programming than others. Or maybe it's just 100% genetic. Or maybe some are in such need of acceptance they irrationally support the corporate-approved narrative. I had this fantasy that if I could understand the way they think, then I could break through the programming. If I understood their mind well enough, then I would successfully convert masses. As I grew, and watched those much smarter than me attempt to convert people, and always fail, I wondered how the leftists could be so stubborn. Surely they saw what was so very obvious to me. How can they refute this perfectly structured and cited argument? But they did it over and over. It was one late night I was researching the Heritage Foundation that I came across the most coherent hypothesis of how the leftist mind works that I have ever heard. The following is a speech by Evan Sayat given at the Heritage Foundation in 2007. I have chosen to accept this as my working hypothesis on how the leftist mind works and why they act like they do. This speech was called one of the 5 most important conservative speeches ever by Andrew Breitbart. I have clipped it to a more digestible length. Please enjoy the abridged Evan Sayat, How Modern Liberals Think.
The Democrats are wrong on just about every issue. Well, I'm here to propose to you it's not just about every issue, it's quite literally every issue. And it's not just wrong, it's as wrong can be. It's 180 degrees from right. It is diametrically opposed to that which is good, right, and successful. All right, what I discovered is that this is not an accident. This is part of a philosophy that now dominates the whole of Western Europe. And the Democratic Party of today, I, like some others, call it modern liberalism. And the modern liberal will invariably side with evil over good, wrong over right, and the behaviors that lead to failure over those that lead to success. Give the modern liberal the choice between Saddam Hussein and the United States. He will not only side with Saddam Hussein, he will slander America and Americans in order to do so. Give them the choice between promoting teenage abstinence and teenage promiscuity. And believe me, I know this from my hometown of Hollywood. They will use their movies, their TV shows, their songs, even the schools, to promote teenage promiscuity as if it's cool. Like the movie American Pie, in which you are a loser unless you've had sex with your best friend's mother while you're still a child. While conversely, NARAL, a pro-abortion group masquerading as a pro-choice group, will hold a fundraiser called F Abstinence. And it's not just F, it's the entire word, because promoting vulgarity is part of their agenda. So the question becomes why? How do they think they're making a better world? Well, the first thing that comes into your mind when trying to understand, as I've so desperately tried to understand, is that if they side always with evil, then they must be evil. But we have a problem with this, don't we? We all know too many people who fit this category who aren't evil. So if they're not evil, then the next place your mind goes is, well, they must just be incredibly stupid. Right? They don't mean to always side with evil, failed, and wrong. They just don't know what they're doing. But we have a problem with this as well. You can't say Bill Maher is a stupid man. You can't say all these academics are stupid people. And frankly, if it was just stupidity, they'd be right more often. Now, what's the expression? Even a broken clock is right twice a day. So if they're not stupid and they're not evil, what's their plan? How do they think they're making a better world? By siding with Saddam Hussein, by keeping his rape and torture rooms open. How do they think they're making a better world by promoting to children behaviors that are inappropriate and cause diseases and unwanted pregnancies and ruin people's lives? What I discovered is the modern liberal looks back on, give me a number here, 50,000 years, 100,000 years of human civilization, and knows only one thing for sure, that none of the ideas that mankind has come up with, none of the religions, none of the philosophies, none of the ideologies, none of the forms of government, none have succeeded in creating a world devoid of war, poverty, crime, and injustice. So they're convinced that since all of these ideas of man have proved to be wrong, the real cause of war, poverty, crime, and injustice must be found, can only be found in in the attempt to be right. See, if nobody ever thought they were right, what would we disagree about? If we didn't disagree, surely we wouldn't fight. If we didn't fight, of course, we wouldn't go to war. Without war, there'd be no poverty. Without poverty, there'd be no crime. Without crime, there'd be no injustice. It's a utopian vision. And all that's required to usher in this utopia is the rejection of all fact, reason, evidence, logic, truth, morality, and decency. All of the tools that you and I use in our attempts to be better people, to make the world more right, by trying to be right, by siding with right, by recognizing what is right and moving towards it. What you have is people who think that the best way to eliminate rational thought, the best way to eliminate the attempt to be right, is to work always to prove that right isn't right, and to prove that wrong isn't wrong, to bring about a philosophy, and you see this in John Lennon's song, Imagine. Imagine there's no countries, not imagine great countries, not imagine defeat the Nazis, imagine no religions. And the key line is, imagine a time when anything and everything that mankind values is devalued to the point where there's nothing left to kill or die for. See, now obviously this is not going to happen overnight. There's still going to be religions, but they're going to do their best to denigrate them. There's still going to be countries, but they'll do what they can to get us to cede our national sovereignty to one world bodies. But in the meantime, everything that they believe is designed. Everything they teach in our schools, everything they make into movies, the messages of the movies, the TV shows, the newspaper stories that they pick and how they spin them, have but one criterion for truth, beauty, honesty, etc., etc., and that's, does it tear down what is good and elevate what is evil? Does it tear down what is right and elevate what is wrong? Does it tear down the behaviors that lead to success and elevate the ones that lead to failure until there's nothing left to believe in? Again, there's quite literally nothing in Hollywood, in the newspapers, in our schools that does not have this as its sole criterion. For example, there is no journalistic standard, none, zero, zilch, by which the misdeeds of a handful of night guards at an obscure prison for terrorists, misdeeds in which nobody was killed, nobody was seriously hurt, there is no journalistic standard by which this is a front page story in the New York Times. Much less for 2 days in a row, 5 days in a row, 10 days in a row, 20 days, 44 straight days. This non-story was a front page story in the New York Times. Why? Because while it met no journalistic standard, it met the one and only modern liberal standard. It said, you think America's good? We found something that's going to make you not believe that any longer. You think that the Islamic fascists are bad? No, 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 no. This is why they do it. No wonder they fly airplanes into our buildings. And that's just one of so many other examples. Newsweek magazine, there was no journalistic standard by which they printed the story of Korans being flushed down the toilet. Not only was it a bogus story, never happened, it's an impossible story. It cannot happen. Think about it. Can you flush a book down a toilet? Right? Try it. Go home and try it. And if there are any liberals here, go to your neighbor's house and borrow a book. And see. But the thing is, even a child, did you just get here, sir? Should I start over? At any rate, even a 5-year-old would know that you can't flush a book down the toilet the first day that he plays that puzzle at school. You can't fit a square peg into a round hole. So why did Newsweek run with a story that was not only bogus, that failed to meet even the most obvious logic? I mean, as I say, it's an old expression. You can't fit a square peg into a round hole, because nothing matters to them. There is no standard, because a standard would require them to say something is better than something else, which goes against this entire philosophy. It met the one and only criterion of truth to Newsweek, which was that it attacked America and justified the Islamic fascist terrorists. And you see this, the same thing's true in the art world. There is no artistic standard. There's no aesthetic criterion by which, forgive me, but a jar of urine with a cross in it is beautiful. There's no aesthetic criterion by which the curators of the museum said, yeah, take down the Monet and put up the urine. But it met the one and only standard of art that exists to the modern liberal. And just as in Hollywood, the movies last year, I don't want to speak to the movies that were nominated this year because I didn't see them all, but the movies from last year met no criterion of storytelling, met no criterion of cinematography. The 5 nominees for Best Picture all met one criterion. Brokeback Mountain said, Heterosexual marriage isn't that important. Go be a homosexual if you choose. Munich said there is no difference between the terrorists and the people who stopped them from murdering again. And if you look at the other pictures as well, ultimately with Crash winning, Crash said America's this evil, horrible nation where every moment of every day is filled with bigotry and racism. Now, clearly not everybody who voted for John Kerry, not everyone, like I say my cousin, but I'll be honest with you, it's my sister, who will mindlessly accept, without question, without doubt, that of course we went into Iraq to steal their oil, because that's what America does. No need to even consider any other possibility. That's how sure she is that America is imperialist and we steal resources and whatnot. Not everyone who voted for John Kerry and who fits that description is aware of the elite's blueprint for utopia. That's what I call it. But what the elite have succeeded in doing through the institutions we've allowed them to control, and if we're going to save America, we must take back the schools, the universities, the media, the entertainment industry. What the elite have succeeded in doing is indoctrinating, starting with the very young and going all the way up through college and beyond, starting the first time they turn on Sesame Street and Buster Bunny, going up through the middle years when they're told, hey, little boy, if you have a queer eye, you're going to be a cool guy. But hey, little girl, doesn't matter how cool you are. If you grow up to be a heterosexual married woman, you're going to be a desperate housewife. And going all the way up in all the other shows that are on the air, I can't say all, but so many of the other shows that are on the air that show family and marriage and all the things that are traditional that we recognize as good, there's the war at home. There's terms of engagement. There's another, it's not terms, it's rules of engagement, as if it's another battle. They wouldn't make room for daddy in shows like those because they were not realistic. So instead we now have the Bundys, where the mother and the father hate each other and looking to get as much as they can from each other. And just this whole mindset. And it continues on through Ward Churchill's ethnic studies class. And what happens is they're indoctrinated into what I call a cult of indiscriminateness. And the way the elite does this is by teaching our children, starting with the very young, that rational and moral thought is an act of bigotry. That no matter how sincerely you may seek to gather the facts, no matter how earnestly you may look at the evidence, no matter how disciplined you may try to be in your reasoning, your conclusion is going to be so tainted by your personal bigotries, by your upbringing, by your religion, by the color of your skin, by the nation of your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's birth, that no matter what your conclusion, it is useless. It is nothing other than a reflection of your bigotries. And therefore the only way to eliminate bigotry is to eliminate rational thought. You know, there's a brilliant book out there, and those of you who know it will recognize how heavily informed my opinion is by it. It's called The Closing of the American Mind by Professor Alan Bloom. And Professor Bloom was trying to figure out, I'm going to be blunt, he was a little less blunt, he was trying to figure out in the 80s why his students were suddenly so stupid. And what he came to was the realization, the recognition, that they'd been raised to believe that indiscriminateness is a moral imperative, because its opposite is the evil of having discriminated. Right? I paraphrase this in my own works. I say, in order to eliminate discrimination, the modern liberal has opted to become utterly indiscriminate. I'll give you an example. At the airports, in order to not discriminate, we have to intentionally make ourselves stupid. We have to intentionally pretend we don't know some of the things we do know. And we have to pretend that the next person who's likely to blow up an airplane is as much the 87-year-old Swedish great-great-grandmother as those 4 27-year-old imams newly arrived from Syria screaming Allah Akbar just before they board the plane. In order to eliminate discrimination, the modern liberal has opted to become utterly indiscriminate. The problem is, of course, that the ability to discriminate, to thoughtfully choose the better of the available options, as in she's a discriminating shopper, is the essence of rational thought. So quite literally, we are dealing with the whole of Western Europe and today's Democratic Party, dominated as it is by this philosophy, that rejects rational thought as a hate crime. So what you're left with after 10, 12, 14, 20 years in the leftist indoctrination centers that our schools have become are citizens of voting age who, on the one hand, are utterly unwilling and incapable of critically judging the merits of the positions they hold, and have held unquestioned since they're 5 years old. And that is so much the mindset of the modern liberals. It's not that they're not aware of all the things that we're aware of. is that they need to reject them in order to remain in this 5-year-old utopia that they've been told is the only hope for mankind. A mindless indiscriminateness. So what you're left with is not only adults, citizens of voting age who cannot judge their own positions, but who are virulently antagonistic to any position other than their own. Why? Because when you've been brought up to believe that indiscriminateness is a moral imperative, any position other than their own must have employed discrimination. This is why Bush is Hitler. This is why Reagan is Hitler. This is why Giuliani is Hitler. How's Rudolph Giuliani like Hitler to a thinking person? Well, in one way. Hitler discriminated against the Jews. Rudolph Giuliani discriminated against the crack-addicted prostitutes in Times Square. Hitler discriminated against the Catholics. Giuliani discriminated against the criminal overlords. Right? Hitler discriminated against the gypsies. Giuliani discriminated against the terrorists on 9/11 and beyond. See, any form of discrimination is discrimination. They know that theirs is the position arrived at through the moral imperative of indiscriminateness. Therefore, any position other than their own must have been arrived at through the employment of discrimination. So this makes you not just wrong on your issues and your stances. They don't even think about your issues and your stances. They don't have to. Even if they were willing to, even if they were able to, they don't need to. Would you sit and contemplate Hitler's social security policy? No, you would fight Hitler. So what you're left with is, after 10, 12, 14, 20 years in these indoctrination centers, and it's not a coincidence, the longer you stay in the indoctrination process, the more morally inverted you become. So what you're left with is people who quite literally cannot differentiate between good and evil, right and wrong, better and worse. But here's a key. Indiscriminateness of thought does not lead to indiscriminateness of policy. Indiscriminateness of thought invariably leads the modern liberal, inevitably leads them to side with evil over good, wrong over right, and the behaviors that lead to failure over those that lead to success. Why? Because in a world where you are indiscriminate, where no behavior is to be deemed better or worse than any other, then your expectation is that all behavior should lead to equally good outcomes. When in the real world, different behaviors lead to different outcomes. You and I know why. Because we think. We know why teenage promiscuity and communities that promote promiscuity tend to fail at a greater rate than communities that promote teenage abstinence. Because teenage promiscuity and teenage abstinence are not the same behaviors. Teenage abstinence is a better behavior. Right, forget the moral component for a moment. Let's just talk practicalities. If your boy's out messing around, he's not home reading a book. If your daughter's down at the abortion mill again, she's not at the library studying for the SATs. If your son's in a hospital bed somewhere dying of AIDS, he's not putting together his 5-year plan. So you and I recognize why those communities that promote teenage abstinence do better than those that promote teenage promiscuity in their music, in their movies, even in the schools. But to the modern liberal who cannot make that judgment, must not make that judgment, that would be discriminating. They have no explanation. So therefore, the only explanation for success has to be that somehow success has cheated. Success, simply by its existence, is proof positive to the modern liberal of some kind of chicanery and likely bigotry. Failure, simply by its existence, no other evidence needed, just the fact that it has failed is enough proof to them that failure has been victimized. So the mindless foot soldier, which is what I call the non-elite, will support the elite's blueprint for utopia, will side with evil over good, wrong over right, and the behaviors that lead to failure over those that lead to success, and have a sense of justice. This is why I said at the beginning, they're not evil. My cousin is not evil. But it's just a mindless acceptance that in a world where she's indiscriminate, where her answer to any political question is, so what? Without any true Socratic desire to have that so what lead to, yeah, let's talk about the real consequences. So what, just being an indiscriminate rejection of any possibility about the future. It's meaningless to them. And it's why John Lennon said utopia was all the people living for today. And by the way, it is not a coincidence that those who live for today now have so much debt. What is debt? It's the failure to repay a promise from yesterday. And vote themselves nothing but more and more entitlements, which is what? Stuff for me, I'll worry about who pays for it later. The same is true of good and evil. Since nothing can be deemed good, nothing can be deemed evil, that which society does recognize as good must be the beneficiary of some sort of prejudice. That which society recognizes as evil must be the victim of that prejudice. So again, the mindless foot soldier will invariably side with whatever policy, mindlessly accept whatever policy seeks to tear down what is good, America, elevate what is evil, until everything meets in the middle and there's nothing left to fight about. It's based on the reality that once you subscribe to indiscriminateness, anything other than indiscriminateness is the evil of having discriminated.
I found this video fascinating. The references are dated, especially in the full speech, but the content is exactly right on. This is the best explanation of how the modern leftist mind works that I have ever seen, and I've been thinking about this question for a long time. It might be worth updating with new references like Drag Queen Story Hour and letting violent felons out of jail while arresting shop owners who just want to pay the rent. Remember, the leftist doesn't just make wrong decisions. They always are 180 degrees from what is good, right, and successful. So what do we do about it? I think understanding the problem is the most important part. Masses of people properly diagnosing the problem is the most important part. And I believe that spreading this video to conservatives and especially to progressives will open some eyes and change some minds. Remember my fantasy about understanding the way they think to break through that programming? Perhaps it's not about us understanding the way they think. Perhaps they need to understand the way they think and why. Maybe that's been the key all along. If you have any progressives in your life, it is worth it to continue attempting to convert them, to continue attempting to understand them, to help them understand the way you think and why, because you are correct. Make a commitment that you each get to share content with each other and agree to watch it with an open mind. Perhaps the content you send them, perhaps this video, will help change their mind. Look, they own all the institutions. Frankly, without us continuing to convert the people in our lives, the future is lost. Progressivism, leftism destroys everything it touches and will only grow more invasive and authoritarian. The canceling of all civil liberties with the Wu flu is an opportunity for freedom and liberty to grow. This was a shock to the system, and somewhere in that leftist psyche, they once cared about their rights. Not long ago, they feared massive corporations and the surveillance state. Put it into terms they understand and take advantage of it. Have the conversations you always wanted to have. Your cause is righteous. You're on the side of good. Please share this video with the people in your life. Accurately diagnosing the problem is the first step to real change. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you know anyone else tackling this subject matter, please link it. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. It really goes a long way. This is The World According to Tony. I'm Tony. Thanks for listening.